My husband's second wife stood up at the will reading and calmly announced that she was cutting me out of Harold's $14 million estate. I just sat there frozen. Not a single tear left in me. She acted like I had never even existed. But then the lawyer suddenly chuckled under his breath. And in that tiny moment, everything shifted. It made me wonder, what had Harold been hiding before he died? And why did it feel like he was still trying to speak to me from beyond the grave? You ever walk into a room that looks like someone has rehearsed sorrow until it's polite? That was the whole of the house the day after Harold's funeral. Neat edges, soft smiles, and all the grief arranged in straight lines. I'm Evelyn Hart. Harold and I kept the same kettle humming for 42 years. I knew how he liked his eggs, how he scolded the cat, and which chair in the living room he claimed as his. I sat up nights in a folding chair the last months of his illness. I can't tell you how many times I smoothed his blanket and watched his chest rise slow and honest. So when the last car pulled away and the folding chairs were carried off like some event crew had come through, the house smelled like him and felt suddenly unfamiliar, like someone had washed the place of its fingerprints. They staged the reception like a small gallery. Napkins folded into triangles like tiny paper hats. Place cards printed clean as a bank slip. The florist left extra orchids because they photographed pretty. I stood there with both hands folded, feeling my own life turned into a display. Folks kept asking, "Are you all right, Evelyn?" Like a polite script line. I kept answering because Harold would have wanted me civil, but my mouth was tight as a screw. Rachel moved through the rooms like she'd always managed the thermostat. She's a neat woman, hair pulled back, posture that says she's ready for a photograph at any moment. She came up to me when I was near the mantel, holding a small velvet box like a magician with a trick. "He asked me to give you this," she said in that soft, efficient voice some people use when they want things to sound thoughtful. I opened it. A simple tie pin. Harold liked polished metal. I touched its edge the way you reach for a familiar coin. No letter. No scrawled note that said anything personal. Just metal made pretty and passed like a substitute for words. Rachel didn't linger. She turned away with that little clipped laugh she keeps in reserve. "We'll be moving forward with the administration next week," she said over her shoulder, bright as if she'd announced a potluck. I blinked. People do odd things when they wear grief like a costume, but this felt curated. A day later the email arrived. "Estate administration meeting scheduled. No hope you're holding up. No, call me if you want. Just a time." I drove past the elm tree Harold loved and pulled up at the guest house instead of downtown. We'd used the drawing room for bridge and holiday cookie swaps. It smelled of eucalyptus and new polish now, the kind of smell that wants you to know money passed through the door. 7 people gathered round. Rachel took the center on the settee like a woman on a dais. A pale young associate nudged a folder my way with the kind of nervousness you get when you're the one who has to say the bad line. I opened it. Ledgers and property lists. The sterile sort of paper that eats the warmth out of a room. She read like she was hosting a meeting. "We will move forward with the administration as filed," she said, voice smooth. "Harold transferred primary control of the family trust to me 6 months ago." The room spun a little. Harold would have told me. He'd have brought it up between buttering toast and complaining about the weather. He'd have asked my opinion. When I lifted my voice it felt small. "What about my share?" The young fellow read from his tablet like a machine. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to Mrs. Hart under the current filing." No one looked at me. No one said, "Evelyn, we thought you'd been told." It was as if the paper were supposed to do the hurting for them. Rachel folded her hands and offered me a smile that was all teeth. "Evelyn, we appreciate everything you and Harold did. Honestly. But these are legal allocations. We'll follow what's filed." Something in me tightened. If I had hollered, maybe someone would have winced. But I don't shout the way I used to. Grief had taught me how to keep my manners as my armor. I left the drawing room and walked home with the drizzle in my face like a small, steady hand pressing. At Harold's desk a manila folder waited like a question mark. He was tidy with his things, a blotter pad, a pair of reading glasses, the little mechanical pencil he used for lists. I opened that folder because sometimes your hands do the asking for your heart. Inside was a single folded note in his careful hand. Rachel wants me to update estate language. Says timing is right. I haven't signed anything. Don't tell Evelyn. I don't want her to worry. His handwriting looped the same as always, steady, a little slow. The words hit my chest like a stone. Harold had doubts and he hadn't told me. He worried and kept it close. Not telling me to spare me worry, fine, sweet, but secretive. There were photocopies tucked under the note. A version of the will Rachel read from that morning and a draft with red ink where my name had once been. The line that used to say to my wife Evelyn Hart was crossed out, and someone had scrawled, "Discuss with counsel." The third page was a schedule of meetings, dates circled months back when Harold had been in and out of treatment. I'd been at his bedside often enough to know he hadn't been alone then. Why would these meetings happen without a whisper to me? I sat with the folder long into the night. I rooted around the house and found little ghosts. His slippers by the chair, a photo of us by the lighthouse, the radio schedule scribbled on a scrap. The house felt like a stage with the props in place, and I was the only one who'd forgotten my cue. I needed a steady head, so I called Miles Granger. Miles has run the feed co-op down on Oak Mill for as long as I can remember. Practical as a plow, he answers plain and quick. "Evelyn? You sound a little off." "You all right?" he said. "I don't unload everything at once." I told him the note, the crossed-out line. "Did Harold ever mention changing the trust?" I asked. A long pause. "No, Evelyn. If he had, you'd have been first to know. That don't sit right. Want me to come by?" When Miles shows up, he carries the kind of quiet that makes you breathe easier. He read the papers the same way I had, slow, with the frown that used to mean he was thinking about fences. "This looks worked up, too tidy," he said. "Too clean. Folks who try to hide get too neat with their hands." We sat on the park bench where Harold and I used to feed the pigeons and plotted a little like conspirators. Quietly, we'd gather copies, ask who'd been around Harold, see who'd seen what and when. No trumpet blare. Harold would have hated a scandal on Sunday. I wanted only the truth, the small stubborn thing. And I wanted to find out whether Harold had been led into this or had let us, and why he'd kept it from me. The folder went under a stack of National Geographics in the hall closet. I went to bed restless and woke up with that particular kind of tired determination that feels like a slow-burning furnace. If someone thought they could slide my name out like a bookmark and no one would notice, they were wrong. People who spend a lifetime together leave marks. We leave fingerprints even paperwork can't scrub clean. Before sleep, a memory of Rachel slid back into my head, the little sharpness in her smile, the way she said, "We'll handle this, you just rest," and that tiny edge of dismissiveness. Later that week, when I saw her at the gate, she paused and said, "Evelyn, it must be so hard for you. But really, we've got it under control." She clipped the words like a clothes peg. Not mean but not sweet either. Just sufficient. That's the tone I want on record, polite, efficient, and a little cold. It told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. And Harold? Harold was sitting in that folder, in those loops of handwriting, asking in the most Harold way for a hand he trusted. I was going to give him one. If you think grief makes people quiet, you haven't met the kind of quiet that hums under a stovetop, low, steady, and full of heat. That's what settled in me the morning after I tucked Harold's note into the National Geographics. A low hum that said, "Don't let this sit." I called Tom Harper first. Tom and Harold had built that little seed and feed co-op on Main together 20 years ago. Men who do that kind of work don't fuss over trifles. They smell trouble the way a good dog smells rot, immediate and blunt. Tom arrived in his truck with a thermos that always smelled faintly of peppermint and hands that still had a farmer's grip. He didn't ask to come in. He walked straight to the drawing room and said, "Eve, did he put you in this paper by mistake?" As if paperwork could be apologetic. I showed him Harold's note and the photocopied will, and he went quiet the way someone does when they find a broken hinge in a place they never expected one. "We'll start quiet," he said. "No drama. We get copies, we talk to folks who saw him in the weeks before, and we find out who was around that weekend." His voice was small but steady, like someone reading a map. I like that. I like people who read maps instead of making speeches. First call was to my neighbor, June. June waters my geraniums when I'm out and knows the comings and goings of half the block. She'd seen Rachel at the house more and more lately. Smooth shoes, quick hands. June said she'd noticed Rachel bringing a man with her once. A tidy-looking fellow who signed for a package and left. He looked like a courier, but not, June said, tapping the porch rail like she was trying to remember the exact flavor of the moment. That was enough to tell Tom we had people to ask. We set out a small plan. I'd quietly ask around, make no big declarations. Tom would check county filings and get certified copies of whatever had been submitted. He'd done small-time legal work with the co-op and knew a woman at records who owed him a favor. "We'll be like raccoons," he said with a grin. Quiet, clever, and looking for shiny things. I laughed then. I needed that. The first twist came from a place I never expected. The park bench. I was sitting there on a late spring afternoon, the air smelling like cut grass and hot pretzels from the vendor cart, when Nina, a soft-spoken assistant who'd once helped with Harold's community drives, wandered over. She'd always been polite, the kind of person who adds sugar with a steady hand. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and for a second I thought she might apologize for the bustle at the funeral. Instead, she lowered her voice like she was tucking a letter into a privacy envelope. "I wasn't going to say anything," Nina said. "Not because I didn't care, but because I had a mortgage and 2 kids and, well, you know how it is. But I kept notes. I wrote things down when I worried. Rachel asked me once to witness something. It felt off." Her fingers tapped the bench. She fished a little planner from her bag and handed it to me. There it was. A short scribble. "Sunday 7:40 p.m. witnessed our signed doc. No H present." My skin prickled the way it does when a radio hits the exact frequency of a song you thought you'd lost. This was the small angle that made suspicion into something solid. Nina had risked her job to write that down. Tom took the planner like it was a map to a locked shed. "This is good," he said simply. "This is a start." We kept moving. Tom pulled county records and found an oddity. The final trust documents had been filed under a different clerk number than earlier drafts, and one of the edits cited a firm that, when we checked, hadn't been involved with Harold before. Whoever had touched these documents had tried to tidy the trail. Neat handwriting, clean scans, timestamps that wanted you to believe everything happened on a Monday morning at 9. People who arrange deceit often like light and order. They hope the shine will be the story's distraction. I felt small in the administrative world. I am not a woman of ledgers. I'm a woman who remembers how Harold liked his socks folded, and who can tell you the right time to prune a rose bush. But I had Tom and quietly other small knowns, June, Nina, Miles. And later, a woman named Anita Vega. Sharp as a tack and not a woman you wanted to argue with unless you had a very good reason. Anita taught estate law for small practices and had a way of making complicated things sound like recipes. This goes in, that gets mixed, this bakes for however long until you can't eat it anymore. She agreed to look things over, not to file paper right away but to tell us whether there was smoke. Anita's house was warm and smelled like cinnamon. Her drawing room was lined with books and a lamp that made everyone look candid. She read Harold's note, the photocopy of the will, and even the scrawl in the margin that said, "Discuss with counsel," and raised one eyebrow. "Not sloppy," she said. "Constructed." She tapped the red edits with a pencil. Someone who had access and an agenda moved pieces. They knew what words to change to remove a spouse from a distribution line. That's not an accident. Her tone was plain, like she just sorted socks into piles and found a mismatch. That night Rachel called. It was the first time we'd spoken since the drawing room meeting, and her voice over the line was like a practiced radio announcer, crisp, polite, the kind of tone you use when you want to manage public perception. "Evelyn," she said, "I hope you're managing. We're simply trying to follow Harold's wishes." There was a thinness to the phrase Harold's wishes that could have folded a paper-thin heart. I had to be careful. I answered in a way that sounded soft enough for the neighbors but contained a steel sliver. "Thanks, Rachel. I'm getting by. I did find some documents in Harold's desk I wanted to ask you about." I kept my voice even. "You were awfully busy arranging things in his last months. I just wanted to understand the timing." There was a click as if she leaned closer to a microphone. "Evelyn, I think you must be misunderstanding," she said. Then, like a small dagger wrapped in velvet, she added, "He trusted me to handle the details so you wouldn't have to worry." I could hear that soft impatience, slight, polished, and I felt my jaw tighten. Handle the details so I wouldn't have to worry, is what people say when they want you to feel useless. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a raised voice. Instead I said, "He also trusted me to be his companion for 42 years. I'd like to be treated like that." She sighed a little bored. "I'm doing what's best for the estate, Evelyn. That's what matters." I wasn't rude to her over the phone. I saved my sharpness for the drawing room later when it would have more teeth. But her tone settled in me like a splinter. She had the gall to make herself the practical one, the caretaker of legacy, while she had been moving pieces weeks before Harold's last days. By then, Anita had pulled something practical for us. She suggested a handwriting comparison. Not a loud forensic spectacle, just a careful comparison of Harold's signatures from known documents with the signatures on the revised pages. She said there were labs that did this kind of thing and that it could be a small nudge in court documents. Inconsistency in signing patterns, pressure points, the slight final flourish a man keeps until the end. It sounded almost intimate, the idea of comparing the way a man held a pen to the way his name trembled on a final sheet. It was also the first real thing we could hold up and say, "See? There is a physical trace of doubt." We arranged to have certified copies made, and to microfilm the dates in question. Tom found a clerk he trusted in records and used an old favor. Junie lined up a neighbor who'd been at the house with Rachel the weekend the signatures were made. Miles took the calendar entries and cross-referenced them with Harold's own notes. We were small cogs making a gentle, steady machine. As we did the small work, the social work kept trying to steamroll us back into silence. Rachel arranged a small afternoon tea at the country club, ostensibly to honor Harold's memory and bring old friends together. She put the invitation in an envelope without a return address and tucked it into the drawer beside the couch so I'd find it like a courtesy. It had the flourish of someone who believed presentation could substitute for conscience. I went. I wore Harold's old brooch and a dress he'd complimented once. I wanted to be present, to hold steady in that room that had been prepped to convey warmth and continuity. The club smelled like lemon polish and floral perfume. People leaned in and said, "We're so sorry," like they were checking the right box. Rachel was there in a pale suit, orchestrating conversations with the ease of someone who had rehearsed kindness. When she saw me, she gave me that thin smile, and because you asked for a little spice, she let a small barb slip out, just under her breath but loud enough for me because I was close. "Evelyn, you look well," she said, the emphasis on the last word. It was light, almost dismissive, but it landed like a cold plate. I answered with what I always answer when a woman thinks she's clever. I smiled slow and steady and said, "Thanks, Rachel. I try. No need to feed the cat. It'll purr at anyone who tosses food." Later, as the tea dwindled and the napkins grew creased, a man at the next table, someone who'd been a board member for years but who had never quite trusted polished words, leaned over and asked me quietly, "Did Harold ever mention any legal changes?" He looked at Rachel and then at me like someone waiting for the real weather report. I told him what I'd found. He nodded and gave me a card with a name, a woman who had once notarized regional trusts and wasn't impressed by tidy signatures. I added her to the list Anita had sketched out. By the time I got home, the sun had folded behind the maple trees and the house felt like mine again in a small way. The kettle on the hob, the light on the kitchen counter. I placed the planner Nina had given me on the table, and sat down with Tom and Anita on the couch. We made no big announcements. We just did the thing that had to be done, build a little evidence pile. Anita wrote a list in her efficient hand. Verified dates, witness statements, Nina June, county filing inconsistencies, the photocopied note in Harold's own hand. Each line felt like a stitch. Before we broke for the night, Tom looked at me and said, "They think this will scare you into silence." He tapped the table steady. "Don't let him. You know Harold. You're part of that story." I felt like crying, and I did briefly, but not from the soft kind of hurt, From the sort that sharpens your edges so you can hold the rest of your life steady. I slept poorly that night, but not from worry. From purpose. If someone thought they could erase a name with a tidy line and a polished signature, they hadn't met the small stubborn things that make a life. The neighbor who waters the geraniums, the assistant who keeps a planner in the glove box, the farmer who remembers how a man laughed. Those small things add up. And because trouble likes company, Rachel sent another note the next morning, this one clipped and formal, suggesting an informal meeting to discuss the estate's future. A chance to clear the air, she wrote. She wanted to meet me in the club's drawing room the next afternoon. I told Tom and Anita, and they both stopped breathing the way you do when someone lights a match. Careful, expectant. Don't go alone, Anita said. Take Nina. Take June. Take Tom. And don't let her make your being there feel like acceptance. You're attending as a witness to your life. So we agreed. I'd go. But not to concede. To collect. And if Rachel thought she could look at me across a satin-covered table and make me small again, she'd be in for the most polite shock of her life. They tell you grief thins you out, makes you quiet and small. They forget that grief can also sharpen you. Make you see the edges of things you didn't notice before. By the time Sam Carver arrived at my drawing room with his sensible shoes and a pile of folders, the grief had settled into something useful. Focus. Sam used to manage Harold's little co-op years ago. Now he handled the practical things with the same unhurried manner. He sat himself down on the wingback chair like he owned the place, and I poured him tea, because some habits are sacred even when the carpet has been rearranged beneath your feet. You kept the papers where you said, he said right away, skimming the manila folder as if his hands could read the paper like a person reads the room. That little traitor under the National Geographics? I answered. Yep. He always liked those maps. Figured I'd hide the truth where Harold used to hide the golf tees. Sam didn't smile. He folded his hands. We're filing to preserve the estate assets. A temporary hold, nothing dramatic. It keeps Rachel from moving money while we check timestamps, witnesses, all of it. Good, I said. No razzle-dazzle. Harold hated theatrics. Sam's brow pulled together. There's more. We ran the county copies. The final filing has a weird case number and, get this, signatures that timestamp to late Sunday evenings, when the building would have been closed. Now, Harold never did paperwork on Sundays unless he thought it was part of a crossword. He did not, under any circumstance, sign things without me glancing at them. Or you. I felt a cold little pebble in the middle of my chest. Not fear. Not yet. Anger? Maybe. Mostly the sensation of betrayal unspooling, thread by soft thread. That week moved like a series of small storms. Nora Viles, who'd taken on the forensic side of things, came to our house with her thermal mug and a legal pad. Nora had the look of someone who'd learned to keep a poker face in law school, and then never forgot how useful it was. She sat at my kitchen table and spread printouts in front of me like a person laying out a quilt. These are the emails we pulled from Rachel's group, she said. There's one where she instructs staff to expedite finalization and remove discretionary clauses. Short, efficient. And here, look at the metadata on the signed documents. 2 signatures logged Sunday night. The security log for the building shows no sign of Harold entering after 3 o'clock that day. I pressed my thumb to the corner of one page like it might hold a truth under its crease. Could someone have forged his signature? I asked, even though the words felt small. It's possible, Nora said. We'll get a handwriting analyst. But the witness timeline is the solid piece. We've found at least one staffer who kept notes. She's nervous, but she kept them. If she'll speak, that will be time-stamped testimony. We scheduled the motions with the courthouse filing date circled in my mind like a small bright bead. The temporary freeze came down like a hush over the house. Official, gentle, but it stopped Rachel from moving things while the court looked. As paperwork churned, life's small, ordinary things tried to assert themselves. I still had Harold's slippers by the armchair. I still made 2 cups of coffee in the mornings because some things are ritual and refusing them feels like admitting the world is broken. One morning, the mailman left a cream envelope with no return address. Inside, A glossy invite to a tribute luncheon Rachel was hosting at the town's country room. Whoever sends an invitation like that expects you to be ceremonial. I put it in the drawer next to the sugar jar and went on with my day. Then Nora called me. "She's ready to talk," Nora said. Her name is Ivy Kane. She worked with Rachel's team part-time. She kept a planner. She's willing to come into the drawing room and speak about a few odd nights. I think courage has a smell. It's partly the nervous perfume of someone stepping into a room they're afraid will change their life. Ivy arrived in sensible shoes, too, clutching a battered planner and a thermos. She was younger than me by a bunch, but not so young that she didn't understand consequences. She sat near the window where the light fell honest on her face and told us about a Sunday night when she'd gone back to the office to fetch a jacket and found Rachel and an assistant with a stack of forms, no Harold. "They asked me to witness," Ivy said, voice small but steady. "I asked where Mr. Hart was. Rachel said he'd stepped out to take a call. She said it was urgent, just sign. It didn't feel right. Something about the way she said it, like it was a task, not a conversation." Nora scribbled. Sam leaned forward. I remember the exact way Ivy's hands trembled when she handed over her planner. On the margin, 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witness signature for R. No H present. She'd written it like a grocery list, but that little note was a window. "You did good by keeping this," I told her. "You did right." I meant it. The world needs people who notice the small, odd things. Ivy nodded as if she'd been waiting for someone to say that aloud. Word travels. Once Ivy's statement was added to the stack, the air around Rachel's name changed. I started getting polite calls from people I hadn't heard from in years, old choir members, a neighbor who'd once borrowed sugar. The kind of calls that said, "We've heard something and we're sorry." Some of them were thin condolences with an edge of guilty curiosity. Others were practical. "Do you want us to watch the house?" A few offered food. Food is the neighbor's love language, and it kept me steady. But you can't eat paperwork. You can't plant a garden with affidavits. The legal world arrived in shabbier garments, subpoenas and depositions scheduled in Nora's drawing room instead of some cold downtown box. For reasons I didn't care to argue, Nora preferred to keep things in domestic spaces whenever possible. "It softened the edges," she said. So Nora had her assistant clear the flatware and set a kettle on the stove for the deposition. The day of the deposition felt like walking into an orchestra pit where someone had already tuned their instrument. Ivy sat across from Rachel's lawyer, a compact woman with hair like glass and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I sat by the window with my hands in my lap, keeping my tea steamy and my face neutral. Harold used to say, "Don't let them see you whirl." He was right. Whirl and they'll pin you to a mood and write it down. Ivy recounted her memory. Small things matter in depositions. The time on the planner. The detail that the forms were printed on a certain kind of bond paper. The way Rachel had said, "We need this done tonight." Nora asked measured questions. The lawyer tried to trip phrases and pin Ivy's memory to gaps. But Ivy had been careful enough to keep dates and little scrawled notes. It's funny. Sometimes people think the truth needs fireworks. Mostly it needs a steady line of small facts. After Ivy left, Nora and Sam huddled like conspirators over a teacup. "We can move to request building security logs," Nora said. "We can ask for email headers, phone records. If someone called Harold's number at an odd hour, or if the file metadata was edited on a closed system schedule, it'll show." Sam looked at me. "Are you ready for all this?" I thought about how many nights I'd sat by Harold's hospital bed, watching the slow clock hands and reminding him to sip water. "I'm tired," I said, "but I'm ready." There was no theater in it, just a woman who'd done her time and wasn't about to be shuffled out. Predictably, the world pushed back. 2 days after the deposition, a formal letter arrived from Rachel's attorney. Polished, precise, the kind of paper that says, "We have more money than you." They accused me of disrupting a lawful transition and suggested I withdraw or face legal costs. The letter's tone was careful and clinical. It assumed my vulnerability was leverage. I put it in the drawer with the invitation and poured a second cup of tea. "Let them threaten," Sam said when he read it. "Threats are paper. We have witnesses and timestamps. Nora added. And the court doesn't like people moving money under an investigation. The freeze stands, at least for now. Despite the chill of legal language, there were small human victories. One of Harold's old friends, a man who runs the neighborhood hardware, came by with a thermos of leftover soup and a story about Harold building a bird feeder out of scrap wood. He didn't know anything about trusts or signatures. He just handed me the thermos and said, "You did right to not let them push you out." People like that are the rafters of the world. Quiet, sturdy, and unexpectedly warm. The foundation of the town started to creak under scrutiny. Ivy's deposition had been the pebble. The ripples reached Rachel's circles. She started using a different voice on the phone, the kind that is always polite and a shade too loud. At a small fundraiser she organized, because of course she did, Rachel made a speech about honoring the past and moving forward. Even her speeches sounded like staged acts. I listened with my back to the room, fingers drumming the rim of my teacup. At that fundraiser, an old board member pulled me aside. He'd been a friend of Harold's from the old days when he taught community workshops. He had the look of someone who'd been clearing brambles for 50 years, and still liked the way the land smelled after rain. "Evelyn," he said, voice low. "Some of us remember the way Harold used to talk about keeping things fair. We never thought he'd be pulled into something like this. If there's anything we can do, tell Sam to call me. I'll testify about Harold's intentions if needed." Small things again. A voice in a crowded room, a hand in the dark. They added up the way pennies do when you're saving for a storm. But the legal machine is patient. Nora filed for a review of the document edits and requested the security footage for the weekend in question. The court asked for more evidence. Rachel's side countered with questions about my standing, my motives. It was a slow erosion of polite civility followed by formal wrangling. Each filing felt like a stone tossed in a pond. The circles widened and opinions formed on the edges. One night, rain hammered on the roof in a way that reminded me of washing machines and thunder. I sat by the kitchen window with Harold's old blanket across my knees and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small packet of letters Harold had tucked away, notes about towns we liked, lists of books he wanted to read, and a folded piece of paper with a line he'd written. "If I ever wander, Evelyn, find the truth." I laughed, and laugh cry is a thing that has all the colors. Finding that paper felt like a small compass given to me in the dark. The work continued. Depositions, metadata. A handwriting examiner's letter arriving with careful wording that said the signatures raised legitimate concerns. Nora called it probative, which is legal speak for "this matters." Sam set up meetings with old neighbors. Ivy, who had been so scared at first, started to look steadier. She called once to check in and said, "Feels like I'm doing the right thing, Mrs. Hart." I told her she already was. "I'll tell you a secret about anger and grief. They can be fuel, but they can also be ballast. You want the fuel to push you forward, but you want the ballast so you don't blow over." I had both. I kept my tea warm. I kept Harold's photograph on the mantel. And when Rachel's lawyer dropped another thinly veiled threat, I simply put the letter in the same drawer and went out to the garden. The daffodils were sleeping in the soil, waiting for spring. I dug a small hole and pressed the last of Harold's seed packets into the earth, not as an act of defiance but as an act of faith. Somewhere between the court filings and the kitchen tea, life insisted on growing. The next move would be in the court's hands. We had witnesses, metadata, and a small steady army of ordinary people who remembered Harold as he'd been. The truth doesn't always burst into rooms with trumpet fanfare. Sometimes it arrives like a neighbor who knocks on your door and says, "I saw something." And you say, "Come in." We had those neighbors now. That night, before bed, I sat in the drawing room by the lamp and held Harold's folded paper. I whispered because whispering feels less like making a plan and more like a promise. "We'll find it, love. We'll find the truth." Outside, the wind slid along the eaves like an old friend. Inside, the house felt less like a stage set and more like a place that still remembered the two of us. The story wasn't finished. Far from it. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a small thread of something I hadn't felt since the funeral. steady forward motion. When you get into one of those little fights with someone who thinks they own the thermostat, you learn quickly how quiet it can be before something breaks. After the park bench and the papers and Miles promising to help, things started moving. Slow enough to feel sensible, fast enough to keep me awake at night. Don Mercer, Harold's old buddy and someone who knows how to read a ledger the way some folks read the Bible, took a copy of the folder to a man he trusted, and that man put me in touch with Lena Alvarez, a probate attorney with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense. Lena didn't have the drama of a TV lawyer. She had the efficiency of a woman who'd spent her life untying knots other people made. We met in the drawing room at my neighbor June's place. Neutral ground, a pot roast on the stove, and no corporate polish anywhere to make me smaller. Lena sat forward on the sofa like she meant business and like business was personal when someone tried to steal another person's place at the table. "Evelyn," she said, folding her hands, "this is straightforward to investigate. Not all things turn into courtroom theatrics. Sometimes it's paper and timestamps and a single witness who remembers an odd night. We'll do it quiet, professional, and keep you out of needless spotlight. But we will move." I liked the word quiet that morning. Quiet was where Harold liked to read, and it felt right that I was about to use quiet the way a grandmother uses a rolling pin, to flatten something stubborn into a shape that made sense. Miles did the neighbor work. He asked around town, dropped gentle questions like pebbles into ponds. People don't like to gossip, but they remember odd details. He came back with small things. The name of a notary who'd been seen at the registry late. The fact that Harold had a lunch appointment with an old tax consultant the month before he got very sick. Little threads. Lena took each one and tied it into a tidy knot on her pad. Then Lena said something I felt in the pit of my belly. "There's an assistant," she said. "Someone who saw staff moving papers late. If we can get her to speak, we'll have a timeline." Her pencil tapped the table like a metronome. "We'll try a deposition. Quiet first. If she won't cooperate, we'll issue subpoenas. But we'll give her a chance." The assistant's name was Nora Hale. She was not a villain in my head. She was a woman who'd probably been up to her elbows in deadlines, a mortgage to pay, maybe a kid's baseball game to worry about. People like Nora don't start big fights unless they're pushed. Lena thought Nora might be the type to want only the truth to be known without becoming the headline. We arranged to meet Nora in the park, of all places. I liked that. The park doesn't pretend to be anything but grass and benches and pigeons that won't remember your name. Lena said it put people at ease. I arrived early and sat on our bench, Harold's bench, though he'd told me not to be sentimental about such things, and felt the wind like a hand turning a page. Nora came up the path slow, hands in the pockets of a sensible coat, eyes surveying like a woman who'd learned caution. She sat down beside me, nose pink from the morning chill, and when she spoke there was no theater, only flat, honest air. "I didn't want to be part of anything," she said. "I kept notes because it felt weird. I thought I'd forget, and then the dates started piling up." She tapped her own planner, a little battered, the kind of thing a person carries when they like making lists and keeping promises. "There was one night I wandered back to my desk to get my jacket. I saw Madison, that's Rachel's assistant, and Rachel going over papers. Rachel asked me to witness something. She said Harold had stepped out, it was urgent, no big deal. I wrote the time down. I didn't think it would mean anything." Nora's voice had the soft edge of someone who'd been frightened, but who also knew standing quiet no longer helped. Lena and Don and I listened. Lena asked calm questions. Don checked names against the calendar. I felt like I was at the core of a small machine that was starting to turn. There were a few things Nora said that made my heart climb into my throat. She remembered the phrase, "move quickly, no delays." She remembered a weekend timestamp. She remembered that the signature line looked odd to her because Harold signed with an almost childish slant on Sundays, and these looked the same as office signatures, not like the shaky ones he'd made lately. Little details, but enough. "Why now?" I asked when Nora hesitated, trying to make sense of the motive. Nora shrugged and looked at her hands. "Power," she said very plainly. "Control. Money does things to people. I don't know what Rachel told Harold. I only know what I saw. Rachel. Her name felt like a cold window. I had seen her before. Gloved smiles, precise gestures, the way she arranged flowers like someone reading a manual. She had a habit of speaking to me as though I were an interruption. I'll admit I said something rude to her once in the drawing room. Not too mean, but enough to keep her on her toes. She answered with that small clinical smile. "I'm just doing what's best for the family," she'd said. "You understand, Evelyn?" "Yeah, honey." I understood perfectly. Nora agreed to sign a statement. She hadn't wanted to before. Fearful of losing her job, scared of being dragged into something big. Lena told her in a tone that was both warm and sharp that truth is a better pillow to sleep on than fear, and Nora signed. Lena filed an affidavit and the document felt, for the first time since Harold had died, like it belonged to something alive. Once we had Nora's statement, the floodgates weren't dramatic. They were quieter. A series of taps that made the whole house creak. Lena filed to preserve assets, to freeze any transfers. Notices started moving through channels like smoke through an old chimney. Rachel's lawyer fired off a letter accusing me of meddling. I folded it carefully and placed it under my teacup like a page from a play I wouldn't read aloud. Rachel responded the way well-practiced people do, poised outrage, an email that read like a press release. She wrote that she had Harold's best interests at heart, and that any suggestion of impropriety was ridiculous. She said she had handled the logistics because Harold had been tired and needed someone reliable. She used words like transparency and respect, and the kind of grammar that is polished enough to make your teeth ache. I read it and then I set it in a drawer. Words are cheap. Proof costs more. The first hearing, a preliminary thing, was scheduled at the county probate desk. Lena told me not to expect fireworks. "These early hearings are about procedure," she said. "They give us time to ask for discovery, and to see what documents are really out there." She had that calm, controlled voice that made you trust the path she was laying. Don stood with me in the doorway of the old courthouse as if he had every right to be there. He smelled faintly of pipe smoke and rain. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and too many coats. People moved with the rhythm of official things. I felt small and then I felt perfectly the size I needed to be. Standing there, I thought of Harold's hands on my wrist, squeezing with the kind of reassurance that said, "You're the one who knows how to keep this house." That memory lent me steel. At the hearing, Rachel showed up with a face like a porcelain doll, and a suit that cost more than my car. She sat with a posture that said she knew half the room. The assistant who'd notarized things avoided my eye. Nora came, and I nodded at her like a fellow traveler who'd seen the same storm. Dawn and Lena arranged papers, and the judge, a weary woman with spectacles on a chain, listened as Lena laid out a simple, clear argument. There was evidence to suggest the documents might have been executed without Harold's full, informed consent and with suspicious timing. Lena asked for forensic examination of signatures, and for records of communications in the months before Harold's death. Rachel's counsel objected with the practiced cadence of someone who's been on both sides of a lot of fights. "Speculation," he said. "Unfounded." The decedent's wishes were made clear. Lena smiled in that small way lawyers do when they know the other side has a paper cut but not a whole wound. "We have a witness who recorded a time when she saw forms," Lena replied. "We have timestamps that don't line up. We have copies of earlier drafts with your client's edits. We're asking for clarity." The judge nodded and set a schedule. Forensics were allowed. Discovery was granted. Walking out of that room, I thought, not for the first time, that adult life is a lot of meetings where someone tries to shuffle you off the page. But the judge had said the word clarity, and to me that sounded like sunlight finding a crack. After the hearing, things at home felt both heavier and lighter. Heavy because now it had the weight of an official thing hovering over the house. Lighter because it wasn't just me whispering in the dark. Lena told me to prepare for delays, for silences that were strategic. "Don't be surprised when it gets quiet," she said. "There's a lot of moving under the floorboards. People regroup. They try new moves." She was right. Silence settled like a blanket in the days after, but it was a watchful silence, not the empty kind that sits in the corners. Then came the invitation, yes, an invitation, to the Hartwell Guild luncheon. Hartwell, The little foundation Harold and I started with 3 volunteers and a coffee earned 20 years ago. Rachel sent it on embossed cardstock, the kind of thing that says we want you present but only as decor. She wanted to show the town she was in charge. She wanted the stage. Lena told me I could go if I wanted. Go steady, she said. Sit, listen, and remember you're allowed to smile without confessing everything. I liked that permission. I dressed in a soft gray jacket Harold had liked and pinned my old silver oak pin to the lapel. He would have liked the gesture. I arrived early and felt the room like a place of small curiosities. Brochures with glossy photos, people exchanging news, a violinist tuning in the corner. Rachel was central, greeting people like a hostess rehearsed for applause. She caught sight of me and gave me that little measured smile that said, "Are you still breathing?" I returned something like a smile and made for a table where I knew 1 or 2 friends would be. My presence felt like setting down a small, honest bowl in a room that expected china. Then a younger board member named Lila, bright, unruffled, the sort who speaks plainly, took the microphone sooner than scheduled. She talked about continuity and mission and then turned her head, looked directly at me and said, "We owe a lot to those who built this from the ground up." She said my name as if it were a small bell. The room clapped. It was nothing theatrical. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't roar, it warms. I stood briefly, nodded, and sat down. That nod felt like the last stitch in a hem I'd been worrying for weeks. After the luncheon, people came up to me with small, genuine words. "We remember Harold's early meetings," someone said. He was a steady hand. A woman I'd never met squeezed my arm and told me a story about the first scholarship recipient who'd later coached kids in town. Each small story patched up the parts of me that felt untapped. That night, Lena called with news. The forensic handwriting expert had preliminary notes. Some signatures were consistent with Harold's earlier, steadier pen. Others looked like they'd been copied, smoothed, or matched in a way that made the expert raise an eyebrow. Lena didn't get dramatic. She never did. But that phone call landed in my kitchen like rain. It was a good rain. The days that followed were quieter and busier at once. Rachel's moves were more subtle. She started reaching out to people who'd once been Harold's friends with little notes and calls. Maybe she thought a steady charm offensive would drown a whisper. One of her colleagues, a man who'd once come to our barbecue, asked me gently if I'd consider helping choose a donor for the summer program. I told him I'd think about it. I meant what I said. I wanted the work saved, not the credit. That sounded silly to say, but to me it was truth. And then, as if someone had opened another window, an envelope arrived at my door with no return address. Inside was a single page. A copy of an earlier draft of Harold's directives, the one with his clear, steady handwriting that named me as co-guardian and co-trustee for certain things. No note. No signature. Just the paper. Whoever sent it wanted me to find it, and they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I cried then. Not the loud kind Harold used to laugh about, but a quiet release. I folded the page and tucked it where I keep letters Harold wrote me, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that tasted like truth. There's a kind of stamina that comes after you decide you won't be erased. It's not spectacular. It's folding the laundry, watering the geraniums, calling your sister. But there's a steadying undercurrent. You feel your feet on the boards again. The house slowly became my house once more. Not everything was fixed. Nothing had been decided. But there were more people who'd stood up with me now, more fingerprints on the papers than there had been before. At night, I walked the garden path Harold planted, the bulbs pushing under the dirt like hope doing its slow work. I talk out loud sometimes, not to Harold, not always, but to the wind, to the moon, to whatever small witness is listening. I say things like, "You don't get to change our life with a pen and a smile." And I mean it. Some folks think a widow should be small, polite, grateful for crumbs. I learned that's not the only way to be. You can be tender and fierce at once. You can keep your manners and also demand the truth. You can make the choice to be seen quietly like a light on a porch. There's more to come. Lena says the forensics will take time. Rachel's people will press back. The quiet will thicken and then shift. But I have pounds of small evidence now. A witness, drafts with names crossed out. A timestamp that doesn't belong. I have friends with steady hands. I have Harold's handwriting reminding me, in loops and slashes, that he knew how to be careful with our life. And I've got something else too. A stubbornness that comes from being someone who's spent a life making soup and mending socks and remembering birthdays. That stubbornness is not loud. It's steady. It's mine. So when the next letter comes, or the next smiling woman glides through my drawing room, I will listen. I will fold a towel and watch the light. I will let the legal folks do their plain blunt work. And I'll stand my ground, quiet, clear, and as sassy as a woman who knows her own worth. Harold taught me a lot of things, but the best was this. Keep your tea warm, your paper where you can find it, and never let someone else tell your story for you. They say the hardest part of any long fight is the in-between, the waiting rooms, the small silences after the big noises. If you've ever stood on a porch watching someone else tidy the life you built, you know the sensation. It's a slow kind of bruising that takes time to show. This was that stretch for me. Not the raw, hot first days. Not the flash of courtroom lights or the sudden testimony that flips everything. No, this was the part where strategy gets careful and people show who they really are by the little things they refuse to give up. After the board postponed their vote and Rebecca, Rachel, to her neighbors who still called her by that tidy name, stepped back from the foundation in the face of that little paper trail we'd put out like breadcrumbs, I thought maybe the worst of it would blow over. Ha! Men who plan dinner parties think the storm is over if the silverware is spotless. Real storms keep rearranging the furniture. First twist. Rachel started small and petty. She sent a florist to the garden club luncheon where I'd been on the guest list for charity work, and the delivery came with a note. Thinking of the legacy. Somebody else might have taken that as a compliment. Me? I read it as a paper-thin attempt to keep the spotlight. Then at the donors' luncheon, the one where I'd been quietly acknowledged, remember? A young woman from Rachel's circle asked me in public, with that smile like a coin, "Evelyn, have you considered stepping back? It's been hard on everyone." I could feel a dozen heads tilt the way sunflowers do. I smiled back because I'd always learned to reply with better manners than they deserved and said, "Honey, I've had my back bent for this work longer than you've had your hair done. I plan on staying upright." But she wasn't done. On a Tuesday that felt mean and gray, I found a glossy brochure slipped under my front door for a gala Rachel was chairing. The kind with photographers and press people and ribbons that smell like ambition. On the back in fine print was language suggesting the foundation was entering a new era. A phrase Rachel loved. It read like a campaign flyer. I folded it and put it in the top drawer next to the folder Lydia had left me. That night I boiled water for tea and let the steam fog up the kitchen window. I told myself to keep calm. Lydia had done the legal work. Daniel had put the right people on notice. Miles still brought over jars of his pickled peaches. But someone had to keep watch. I wasn't giving that house away without a fight. Second twist, and this is the one that made me sit up in my chair. A phone call from Nora Hale, one of Rachel's former assistants. She'd been quiet for a while, the kind of young woman who keeps her head down and her planner full. "Mrs. Hart," she said, voice a little thin. "I don't know if this is my place, but there are emails. And recordings." My heart did that thing where it flips through its pockets looking for courage. I'd been careful with people, choosing friends who'd been through floods and still showed up with mops. Nora was a mop carrier. She came by the next morning carrying a paper bag with a carton of coffee and 2 packets of sugar like she was bringing moral support in solid form. We sat on the back steps, the wood giving that familiar sigh when you lean on it. Nora's hand shook a little as she passed me an envelope. Inside were printouts and, this is what made me slow my breath, a transcript of a voicemail Rachel had left for one of the board members the month before Harold's last hospitalization. The voice on the message was sharp, efficient. "Make it seamless," Rachel had said. "We don't need any surprises. Move things along. Quietly." The phrase was small and ordinary, but the intention behind those words sounded to me like a hand closing around something that wasn't hers. There was an attached audio file too, compressed and shaky when Nora had pulled it off an old laptop. I sat back and listened on my phone with the volume small. Because even secrets deserve a quiet room. You shouldn't have this, Nora said, watching me like the truth might hurt her if it landed wrong. I kept copies because I don't know. I thought I might need them if things got ugly and I wanted to sleep at night. Her eyes met mine and there was a bravery there that made me think of the daffodils in the community garden, stubborn and yellow in the thaw. I told Lydia about Nora the minute she left. Lydia listened. No flourish, no dramatic gasp. Lydia is the kind of woman who keeps a legal pad like a shield and uses it for very precise jabs. Good, she said simply. We'll add that to Discovery. It's not theatrical, it's documentary. Boards are sensitive to optics. This changes the optics. Rachel's reaction came quick and petty as a snapped shoelace. She began an undermining campaign. Phone calls to longtime donors with carefully worded emails. A few op-eds gifted to a columnist who liked polish over substance. Someone even scraped together a rumor that I'd mismanaged funds in an old scholarship program. Nonsense, but rumor is like spilled water. It creeps and stains. The first time I got one of those calls, I laughed in the face of it. Laughed until my chest hurt. You can keep my house warm if you like, I told the caller. But you can't buy my memory. I said it loud enough that Miles heard me through the screen door, and came over with an extra bowl of soup. Third twist. The community started to show itself. Not everyone had been fooled by the garden party gloss. A man from the scholarship program, quiet middle-aged named Carl, called with old receipts and a typed note that proved the funds had been used properly, accounted for down to the last dollar. A neighbor who owned the bakery brought a pie and as she handed it to me said, "We all remember Harold's laugh. Don't let them forget." Those small unexpected courtesies felt like stitches being sewn into a torn fabric. Meanwhile, Rachel brought her fire. At a trustees' luncheon she asked me, in front of other people she expected to be allies, "Evelyn, are you still handling the mentorship files personally?" "It's sweet." Sweet. I felt the word on my tongue like a stone. "Why yes, Rachel, I am," I answered. "Because I like to know the names of the kids who get help. It's less sweet when people hand out charity like it's a press release." Her jaw flickered. She shot me a look I can only describe as professional irritation. There was a light rude edge to her voice then, a tiny barb. She said, "Maybe it's time to let go of the old ways." I said nothing dramatic. I simply folded my napkin and stood up. "Old ways feed girls in tough neighborhoods," I said, voice steady. "They keep roofs from leaking. We'll keep them." Legal wheels turned too. Lydia filed for more documents. Bank transfers, timestamps, communications. Daniel, who likes to make lists and fold corners of legal pads, tracks small anomalies. An email server timing that jumped by 30 minutes on a night someone swore they had been home. An odd notation in a ledger about a vineyard sale that had never completed. We weren't out to punish. We were out to prove intent. Intent is the thing that lifts a murky waterline off a man's good name. And then something odd happened that made my teeth clench and then loosen all at once. A certified letter arrived from someone I hadn't expected. Harold's old accountant, a retired fellow named Jasper who used to come by to bring in tax paperwork and linger for a while about the neighborhood's coffee. He'd found an unsigned page tucked in a stack of invoices. A page Harold had written months before he died with a list of intentions. Simple things like check vineyard paperwork and ask Evelyn about kids' fund. Jasper sent it with a small note. He trusted you. That was all. The paper felt like a hand placed on my shoulder across a room. It didn't prove wrongdoing, but it bolstered the pattern that Harold had been unsettled and that his intentions were not the neat, final document Rachel had waved like a flag. Another quiet moment, the fourth twist of this part, hit at home. I was sorting Harold's sweaters when I found an envelope with no address. Inside was a short letter in Harold's small familiar script. It was not a will or a legal document. It was a private note, the sort he'd leave tucked behind a book or in a pocket. It read, "Evelyn, if the world grows noisy, look for small truths." He had underlined the sentence twice. I sat on the floor and let myself cry for a long time. Not loud. Not theatrical. Quiet, a cleaning out cry. It felt like a finishing of something and the start of something else. By then the press started sniffing around. I don't like cameras. They make you small, they shape smiles into sentences you didn't say. But one reporter, a woman named Sarah, who'd covered local nonprofits for years, called and asked if she could come by the house for a piece that wasn't mean. "We want to cover what happens when the community keeps its hands on a legacy," she said, and I liked that phrasing. When she arrived, she sat on our back steps and asked about Harold's first summer teaching kids to fish. She asked about the scholarship that helped a boy named Marcus go to trade school. She didn't ask about the money up front. She asked about the people. Her article later called our work stubborn kindness, which I think is the nicest thing anyone's written about us since the wedding announcements. And through all this, Nora kept arriving with small things: a printout of a calendar entry Rachel had tried to bury, a voicemail timestamp, a note that proved an assistant had been asked to falsify attendance at an urgent meeting. Her courage didn't roar. It trickled. But puddles gathered to become streams. Nora and Ava, remember Ava, the one who'd first reported that late night? These younger women were the ones who finally started to make the neat lines Rachel had drawn wobble. Court filings increased. Rachel's lawyers sent letters that smelled of expensive paper and duty. They suggested I was being dramatic, that grief makes people see ghosts. I poured a cup of tea and read the letter, and then I cooked soup and mailed another set of documents to Lydia. I found that action steadied me more than words. You can get stuck in rhetoric. You can lose yourself in someone's pretty speech. I preferred receipts and timestamps and a neighbor who could swear Harold wasn't at an office on a certain Sunday. The last part of this chapter was a small victory that felt enormous. Lydia filed for a limited forensic review of the signatures on the contested documents. It wasn't a knockout blow. It was a scalpel. When the report came back with enough discrepancy to say, "This needs explaining," I lit a candle at the kitchen table and let its thin flame make shadows that were, for once, honest. Miles stopped by with pickled peaches and a grin that said, "We knew." Nora texted an emoji that was the fists up sign, the digital equivalent of two knitting needles clicking together. Rachel, in the meantime, had started to meet resistance from people who'd once let her glide through rooms. She found fewer audiences for her op-eds. One of the donors she'd courted called to say he preferred his philanthropy clear of drama. Small, ordinary defeats pile up. You'd be surprised what a few canceled reservations do to a person's posture. That night, as I sat with Harold's letter, Nora's envelope, and the forensic page that Lydia had left on my desk like a quiet flag, I felt the arc of the last month's shift. I wasn't naive. I knew there would be more hearings, more lawyers, more smooth smiles aimed at making me tired. But I wasn't the same quiet woman who sat silent at the start of all this. I'd found allies in young women who kept their conscience tucked in their planners. I'd found neighbors who still knew how to be neighborly. I had a folder of Harold's own doubts that said he'd tried to speak. That mattered. Before I turned out the light that night, I went out to the garden and sat on the bench Harold and I had bought on a whim when we were 30. The moon was a thin coin above the maple. I put my hand on the rough wood and felt the years like rings. I spoke out loud because sometimes words are kinder when they're given room. "We're not done," I said to the air, to Harold, to whatever keeps watch over stubborn things. "But we're moving." And then, in the kind of small private way that is its own kind of revolution, I laughed. Not because I'd won anything yet, but because I'd remembered that laughter is a muscle. You have to keep using it if you want it to sound like you. The fight was not finished. Part 6 would bring the hardest decisions and the clearest proof. But in this quiet corner of the night, with a neighbor's pie cooling on the sill and Nora's courage tucked like a folded map in my pocket, I felt something firm and bright. The story I'd been in for 42 years would not be rewritten without me getting the last honest line. You ever get that feeling like a long, slow inhale finally finding the exhale it's been holding? That's what this last part felt like, only not all at once. It came in small, honest moments that glued themselves back into my life like buttons on a favorite cardigan. I'm Evelyn Hart, and this is how the end of it all wrapped. Not with a bow, but with the sort of plain truth Harold used to like: steady, unshowy, impossible to fake. The courtroom that morning was smaller than I expected. I pictured marble columns and a television crew, But it was just a plain room with wood paneling and chairs that creaked in their own memories. Daniel walked in first, always the quiet one, with a face like he'd swallowed a calendar and found patience on the other side. Lydia came after, brisk and efficient, an adult who had kept her pen ready for the moments life needed sorting. Miles took his spot by the window, boots planted like he'd been waiting for this day since he first said he'd come. I sat near the front, a plain scarf around my neck and Harold's old watch in my pocket, because some things you don't let go of all at once. We'd filed the motion to contest, of course. Lydia had done it the way a good stitcher takes apart a seam, careful, precise, knowing which threads to tug. Ava's deposition had been the hinge. The assistant's notes, the calendar checks, the security logs. They were the screws Lydia tightened until the whole thing stopped wobbling. The judge read the papers with that deliberate slowness that turns noise into fact. I avoided looking at Rachel, but she found me with that eyes glued on the map stare of someone who'd been plotting routes for weeks and finally found a detour. When the judge spoke, it felt less like thunder and more like the clarity after a night of bad radio. He said there were substantial questions about the validity of the contested instruments and authorized discovery. In plain terms, we could look under the hood. Rachel's face tightened, not with surprise, but with that calculated inconvenience people show when their plans bump into details. Her attorney hissed something to her, and she folded her hands like a woman practicing patience, like it was a new accessory. After court, the real work began. Lydia served subpoenas, Daniel ordered copies, Miles and I knocked on doors, not literally, we called people, we asked questions the way neighbors do when something smells wrong on the block. There were meetings in the drawing room with tea that went cold because no one could hold still long enough to finish it. Lydia laid out timelines like a teacher, emails, phone logs, notarization timestamps. She said things like metadata and forensic analysis, and I learned to trust the cadence of her confidence the way I once trusted Harold to check the fuse box. We had a break where the world tried to pretend nothing massive was happening. I watered the geraniums, paid a bill, got the dry cleaning, and for an hour it felt as ordinary as bread on the counter. Then my phone rang and Lydia's voice came through like a bell. They produced additional documents. Daniel met me at the park bench where Harold and I used to sit on lazy Sundays. We unfolded the new pages like maps and found a trail that didn't make sense. A series of drafts with initials that didn't match Harold's usual scrawl. A paid notary registered at a residential address miles from anywhere relevant. Emails from Rachel's account with subject lines that read like marching orders. One line said, in plain office speak, expedite liquidation. My hands went small and hot around the paper. You should meet the little people who help keep the world honest. Ava was one of them. She came over to the house one afternoon like a girl bringing pie to an aunt, tentative, responsible, with ink stains on her fingers. She sat in the drawing room and we talked about what she'd seen, what she remembered smelling in the office late one night, the way Rachel had asked for help with a signature. When I told her she had changed everything simply by speaking up, she looked at me like she'd been waiting for permission to do the brave thing she already planned to do. She stayed to have tea and then left with a promise to listen for more. Discovery pulled the curtain back. There were phone records that placed Rachel at the hospital during odd hours where, according to the security logs, Harold had been alone. Emails surfaced with attachments that didn't have Harold's fingerprints. Scans that had been cropped and resaved with dates that suggested someone had been editing the timeline. Lydia brought in a handwriting analyst who made little dance-like notes about stroke pressure and hesitation marks. The analyst said what I already felt in my bones. Harold's hand held the pen like a man steady with a lifetime, not the slowed, shaky lines that appeared on a later document. Rachel reacted in her way. She sent a note to the press, glossy, measured, the sort that reads like a genteel performance review. She hosted small gatherings at the country club, told people Harold had entrusted her, that she only wanted to honor his wishes. At one of those gatherings, Miles, who has the particular habit of asking plain questions the way a baseball umpire calls strikes, cornered one of Harold's old partners. You should have seen the way the partner's face changed when Miles asked, "Did Harold ever say to you Evelyn will handle things?" That man had to swallow a story and hand it back. He'd been told nothing. We started hearing more half answers, people who had assumed things because Rachel made it easy to assume. There were low moments, sure. There was a letter from Rachel's lawyer threatening counterclaims, demanding costs, insinuating I was a grief-addled troublemaker. There were nights sitting in the dark with Harold's sweater, and thinking maybe this would never change. But then a piece of paper would arrive, a ledger here, a timestamp there, and the weight shifted just a hair. Lydia reminded me that law is slow because truth is stubborn. You have to feed it one fact after another until it can't pretend to be anything else. Courtrooms carry their own kind of theater. There are reams of exhibits, and witnesses who come to testify with their own small dramas. Ava took the stand with a steady voice. She described the late-night meeting she'd broken into, the forms Rachel had asked her to witness, the way Rachel, had said Harold would be right back, as if a man's presence could be summoned like a ringtone. Daniel cross-examined with the patience of someone stirring a pot. Lydia presented the metadata like a litany. When the forensic analyst compared Harold's known signatures to the document in question, the difference was clear as the wash on a sunlit day. In the hallway after one hearing, Rachel approached me. I did not step back. She stood near the ficus and folded her arms like a woman who'd rehearsed the tight smile enough to make it ache. "Evelyn," she said with a tilt, "why all this noise? You could have let Harold rest." Her voice carried that casual cruelty people use when they think pain can be negotiated away. I felt the old flinch, the one that came with grief, and then I thought of Harold's hands, how they held my elbow steady the day he taught me to mend a fence. I looked Rachel right in the eye and I said, "I would rather make some noise than let someone tidy my life away without me in it." She harumphed, which is a polite word for the small sharp sound she made, and walked off as if she'd delivered a verdict. The judge's final hearing was not a lightning bolt. It was a measured thing. Lydia stood up and presented the chain of evidence like a woman laying quilts on a bed. Careful overlap, a clear pattern. Daniel read passages from emails. Miles sat with his jaw set like someone holding a ladder steady. The judge listened and at the end, he said what I had stopped daring to say aloud. There was enough doubt, enough procedural irregularity, enough of a trace of someone exerting influence while Harold was vulnerable, to warrant the court setting aside the contested filings until they could be properly authenticated. That decision didn't come with confetti. It came with relief like rain after weeks of drought. Rachel's posture hardened. She sent a terse statement that she was withdrawing certain recent actions to avoid further turmoil. Her name began to slip from plaques and invitations like a penny dropped into a fountain. The foundation board, who had been quiet until now, called for an internal review. Old friends who had been quiet returned with notes and memories, small acts of public repair. It was not the sweeping drama you see on television. It was a slow, persistent peeling away of pretense. I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in a long time. I walked into the foundation storage room and pulled out a box of Harold's early notes. He had started the program with a scrap of idea and a refusal to take applause. He'd always said the work was about seed and soil, not names. I told the committee exactly that. I offered to help with a mentorship file from years back, just to make sure the original heart of it, the kids, the scholarships, didn't get lost under the polish of new initiatives. They thanked me, meaning it. You don't suddenly become a woman untouched by sorrow just because the court says so. There were afternoons where the quiet felt like an accusation. There were evenings where I sat and listened to the house breathe in the way a place misses a person. But there were also small luminous things. A letter from a young woman who'd received a stipend decades earlier, and now mentored girls in a neighborhood with cracked sidewalks. A neighbor who stopped by with a lemon tart because she remembered Harold liked things simple. A board member who sent a note. "You were right to stand up. If you ask me if I forgave Rachel, I'll tell you the truth in the plain way I learned from Harold. Forgiveness is not a light switch. It's a slow untying. For a while I felt a quiet, useful anger, the kind that keeps folks honest. Then somewhere between packing up Harold's study and planting bulbs in the garden, that anger softened into something else. An acceptance that people are complicated, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is keep your own hands busy with what matters. Months after the last hearing, Lydia came by with a small packet and a smile that was all business and softness. The court had recorded my rights as Harold's co-trustee in an official transcript, and our motion had put a marker down, not a trophy but a record. She asked if I wanted to pursue damages. I told her no. I wanted the record, not a ransom. She squeezed my hand, understanding in the way a good friend does when you choose the path that keeps the light clear rather than the one that burns everything down. The Foundation's next annual luncheon had my name on the list of invited guests. I went because Harold liked me to keep showing up. I pinned his old lapel pin to my collar. It feels strange to wear someone else's emblem of steadiness, but I liked the weight of it. A young board member, one who had been new during the whole mess, gave a short speech about continuity and gratitude. She looked right at me and said, "We are grateful for those who hold the past steady so the future can grow." Folks around the room clapped like polite waves. I nodded, which is the sort of gesture Harold would have liked. Not big, not showy, just true. The days after felt ordinary, and that has been the biggest gift. I make the bed again, and sometimes I fold Harold's shirts because the muscle memory of it calms me. I take long walks with Miles and we talk about baseball and the way the sky looks in June. I still set an extra cup now and then out of habit, but it is less a hope of company and more a notch of habit toward generosity. I keep the folder with Harold's earlier will in the top drawer of his desk, not hidden but kept like a lantern on a shelf, a reminder that truth, once lit, does not easily go out. If this whole thing taught me anything, it's that people will try to edit the stories of others when they think no one's watching. They will tidy, rearrange, and cut lines to make the scene look cleaner. But lives are not scripts to be trimmed. They are stubborn human things full of fingerprints and untidy loyalties. Harold and I built a life that had small, fierce honesty at its center. That honesty, once called, draws folks like Lydia and Daniel and Ava and Miles, ordinary people with steady hands, and together you make a kind of music that will outlast the polished performances of those who prefer a stage. So I sit in the drawing room on Sunday afternoons and read the paper. The light falls across the rug the way it always did. I keep a cup of tea within reach. Sometimes I talk out loud about nothing at all, because there's a comfort in hearing your own voice fill the room. Harold taught me to see the small things. The color of a robin's breast at dawn. The way a neighbor will string lights on a fence without fanfare. Those are the things I want to carry forward. If my story reaches you and you're standing in a room where someone else is trying to direct the scene, I'll tell you the only thing that helped me. Gather your papers, call your friends, ask the questions you thought you didn't have the right to ask. Be patient, be stubborn, and keep your hands busy with the work you know matters. The truth is not always loud. Often it's patient, but it's also persistent, and sometimes that persistence is enough to bring everything back into focus.